This is Tornado Talk, a weekly podcast about one of nature's most fascinating phenomenons. Share your tornado story online by email or call us toll-free 800-439-1570. That's 800-439-1570. Now, meteorologist Jennifer Naramore and Dan Holliday, Tornado Talk is on.
He is one of the most popular figures on cable television. During tornado season, his appearance on the Weather Channel often signals that severe weather is underway somewhere in the country.
We've given a torcon today, the first time in the history of the Tornado Condition Index of a 10 for northern parts of Alabama. It's pretty much guaranteed there's going to be a tornado within 50 miles of you if you're in the northern half of the state.
He's the severe weather expert, and we wanted to know more about him.
Dr. Greg Forbes was born near Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He always wanted to be a scientist, earned a degree in meteorology at Penn State University, but later had the opportunity to work with one of the world's best, Dr. Ted Fujita at the University of Chicago.
This is Greg Forbes, my student, and I flew over to take a picture of the whole area. And this is one of the pictures which shows that I think it's a grain elevator up here. Could you tell me how big is this and how it happened?
We've received your email questions for Dr. Forbes, and he answers what you wanted to know about severe weather and tornadoes.
Plus, we learn more about Dr. Forbes on a personal level. What mischief did he get into as a child? What does he do in his spare time?
What are his favorite snacks? And what would he be doing now if he wasn't doing weather?
This is Tornado Talk, up close and personal with a severe weather expert at the Weather Channel, Dr. Greg Forbes.
We wanted to know how long ago the weather bug bit Greg Forbes. He told us it goes all the way back to junior high.
Well, I got interested in meteorology as a student. I was in the 7th grade, and the teacher taught a module on meteorology. I had sort of known at that point that I wanted to be a scientist, but I didn't really know that meteorology was a pure science. You know, you could watch television and it seems like they had clowns and everybody else that were just doing the weather, so it didn't seem too serious. But we drew maps from weather data and looked at clouds and so on, and then watching one of the TV meteorologists, Joe DiNardo, on the Pittsburgh channel, he seemed pretty professional, so I realized then that meteorology was a true science, and so based upon the weather forecast, we lived out in the country, so if it was going to be a sunny day, my mother, after washing clothes, would hang them out on lines to dry instead of using the dryer, and so I realized that accurate weather forecasts could really impact people's lives. So I thought, well, I'm going to be a meteorologist and do that, and then once I got to Penn State and started studying meteorology, we started learning about the work that Dr. Fujita was doing, not just with the Fujita scale, but he was doing had done all sorts of exciting things about severe thunderstorms and weather patterns and analyzing weather data to better understand and predict these. And so I thought, wow, that's what I want to do. I want to go and study with Dr. Fujita and be a severe weather forecaster. So it started in 7th grade, and then the severe weather aspect of it came on while I was an undergraduate.
It's often said when opportunity meets preparation, you find success. Such is the case with Dr. Forbes. What led him to where he is today?
Most of everything I came to be sort of came about in 3 ways. One, from all the wonderful professors I had at Penn State that taught me most of what I know about weather forecasting, and then the studies and the time with Dr. Fujita taught me most of what I know about severe weather in terms of storm structure and looking at radar, and then my own experience in studying and looking at journals and attending conferences after I got my Ph.D. keeps me current in terms of all the research and the state of the science that's going on. So it's threefold. There's but there's a lot of luck that goes involved in a career also. I got very lucky. Dr. Fujita didn't have very many students, and in order to have students, he needed to have financial support. I wouldn't have been able to afford to go to graduate school, I would have had to taken a job, but I was able to get a graduate financial assistantship from Dr. Fujita, but he didn't really have any when I first applied to him, and he said, well, might be getting some money coming in, and so I held off. I was accepted to 3 graduate schools. 2 of them had already offered me assistantships, and I was holding out, waiting for Dr. Fujita. One of them I had to, one of them then had to say, they couldn't wait any longer. And finally, Dr. Fujita said he had the money, so I was very lucky in that regard. And then while I was at the University of Chicago, I had gotten my master's degree, but he was running out of money again, and I was literally on the day of the 1974 super outbreak. I was being interviewed for a position with the National Center for Atmospheric Research to go fly an aircraft in a project called GATE. They were looking at the genesis of Atlantic tropical cyclones from disturbances coming off of Africa. So I would have been flying around in an aircraft at low altitude in these storms coming off of Africa. So, but for the super outbreak, 74, I would probably have wound up being a hurricane expert instead of a severe weather expert for a profession. With that super outbreak, Dr. Fujita pulled me aside and said, well, you might want to hold off if you can hang on. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get some more money, research funds coming out of this super outbreak. And indeed, that wound up being the case. And so I was able to stay and get my Ph.D. studying the super outbreak tornadoes from using radar and using video of a tornado that had multiple vortices, suction vortices, and measuring some of those. So a lot of luck there in a couple of ways, and luck in the sense that I was lucky to get a faculty position at Penn State. I had called or written to one of my former professors, John Kerr, and asked if he'd write me a letter of recommendation to another university, and he said, well, sure, but we actually have a temporary opening here. Why don't you apply for that? And so I was able to get on initially at Penn State and then wound up getting into a tenure track position and wound up being there for 21 years. And but at that point, I was starting to get more and more away from severe weather forecasting or anything forecasting. I was teaching all the time and even teaching classes on statistics and computer applications in meteorology, and so I was sort of getting a little frustrated, and the Weather Channel came along and said, well, we're expanding our expert team to include a severe weather expert. Would you be interested in applying for that? And I said, well, yes. And so as it wound up, I was able to get that position. And so to get where I've gotten, it's taken a lot of diligence and a lot of hard work and on my part, but there's always in people's careers, there's a lot of luck. You have to be in the right place in the right time and be in a position to take the opportunities when they come your way. Now, in terms of the question about the University of Chicago and my experiences with Dr. Fujita, boy, that's a long topic. I mean, from an excitement standpoint, on one level, I got to fly around in Cessna aircraft hundreds and hundreds of hours looking at tornado damage, and so that's just an eye-opening experience. The structure of tornado damage patterns that you can see from the air is just tremendous. You don't get that kind of perspective on the ground. And then part of the financial support was from NESDIS, the satellite folks. They had the geostationary satellites that we take for granted now were just in their infancy stage while I was a graduate student. And so they wanted to really know, could you look at the overshooting top behavior, the up and down behavior of the thunderstorm tops? Did that relate at all to severe weather and tornadoes? So we would fly around in Learjets just a little bit behind the line of storms at that time it wasn't a video camera; it was a movie projector, and that shot at high speeds, and then taking time-lapse video of these time-lapse movies, actually, of these overshooting tops, and then we would take them back to the lab and use photogrammetry to measure the up and down motion of those cloud tops. So that was extremely interesting. I always kidded people, well, you never know, the Rolling Stones might have been in this Learjet the day before we flew in it. They were just aircraft release. They made some small modifications to the aircraft to enable us to be photographing out the windows at such high altitude. So that was extremely exciting. And then every day when Dr. Fujita would go home and work and make drawings, conceptual models, and other research that he would do at night, every morning he would come in and yell down the hallway for me to come and interact with him on what he had done.
I'm coming here as a scientist, because we do research on tornadoes. And the main reason why we are here is to find out what tornado did. And in case of future tornadoes, what people should do, that's the kind of thing we want to find out.
And I would sometimes be out doing the damage surveys with him, so all of those were just priceless moments. I was there for, basically the confirmation of suction vortices. I was there for the discovery while he made the discovery of microbursts. We had been part of the discovery of downbursts in our damage surveys and relating that to radar, and I was the field manager for the first field project to study microbursts, MIST, in the summer of 1978. And so it was extremely exciting times. I could just go on forever about, as memories came back to mind about, it was just so exciting. I had originally gone to the University of Chicago intending to get a master's degree and then go off and be a severe weather forecaster at what now is called the Storm Prediction Center. But it was way too exciting what I was doing, and when Dr. Fujita said you should stay for your Ph.D., you do that. And so that got me off into research and academia. I thought, well, basically at that time, a Ph.D., I would have been overqualified for the Storm Prediction Center, but later, as that Ph.D. came to my benefit when in putting me in the expert position for the severe weather expert at the Weather Channel.
Dr. Ted Fujita made an impact not only on Dr. Forbes, but science in general. It was 45 years ago that he created the damage scale for tornadoes. Yeah,
Dr. Fujita came up with a Fujita scale in 1971. That was before I started at the University of Chicago. I started there in the fall of 72. So a lot of the early testing of the Fujita scale in terms of doing some of the damage surveys and using the Fujita scale, I was part of that.
More than 35 years later, the damage scale for tornadoes would be enhanced. Dr. Forbes said it had been in the works for quite a while.
Starting in 1974, that super outbreak with the destruction to schools in a number of places got the engineering community much more involved in tornadoes than they had been in the past. And so they started looking at the wind speeds that Dr. Fujita had proposed for the original Fujita scale, that one that was developed in 1971. He came up with those wind speeds without a whole lot of scientific basis for it. There wasn't very much in the way of engineering studies to say really what kind of wind speeds and what kind of wind forces would do various kinds of damage. And so he used whatever little bits were there, plus kind of his intuition. But the engineers pretty quickly began to say, once they got more heavily involved, that, hey, these wind speeds, the total destruction of a house and breaking it to bits, F5, 261 to 318 miles per hour, it doesn't take anywhere near those kind of wind speeds to totally disintegrate a house. And so they started proposing, what now are the EF5 wind speeds that were more like 200 to 220 miles per hour for the for the top wind speeds needed to damage most of the kind of structures that typically are seen. There's only a few very heavily engineered structures that would withstand higher wind speeds than that. Of course, high rises, the building will withstand that, but the windows and everything else will break, and it'll just destroy kind of the insides of the buildings. But so after several decades, 3 decades, I guess, of their influence, including a lot of the influence that sort of brought the engineering community into the meteorological community. Tim Marshall, having both a degree in engineering and meteorology and attending both kind of seminars and conferences, and publishing some papers and things like that, he sort of began to infiltrate engineering information into the meteorological community. And so I was part of a team then and as was Tim Marshall, there were 3 meteorologists and 3 engineers that met together and went through painstakingly type of structure by type of structure, and what did we really think winds were needed to cause that kind of damage. And so that consensus then became the basis, still albeit somewhat subjective, but better tuned to what we now call the enhanced Fujita scale. And there are very much more detailed, on a structure by structure basis, guidelines for what wind speeds are needed. The details were very sparse for the original Fujita scale, and it was not very specific by different types of structures. And so things are a lot more specified now than they were in the original Fujita scale, but they're probably still not perfect, and there still are a lot of different kinds of structures that really are not covered in those guidelines. The damage descriptors, the set of those is not comprehensive. There's some things that happen out there that like bridges collapse or things like that, or even vehicles. It's very difficult because of the different types of vehicles and their orientation to the wind may be unknown and so on, that are very difficult to assess wind speeds by virtue of damage to them.
Recently, some meteorologists have expressed interest in seeing mobile Doppler radar winds used in tornado damage surveys. Would Dr. Forbes like to see them incorporated?
Well, I think ultimately the mobile Doppler radar winds could become used and should become used, but the problem is at the moment that for the most part they're measuring winds that are often some above the ordinary home altitude, and frankly most of the damage that is caused by tornadoes is by relatively low buildings, homes, and occasionally business buildings. A much lesser extent any tall buildings get involved. So the enhanced Fujita scale is really designed to be at about the 10-foot level, the rooftop level or near the top of the first floor, whereas most of the mobile Doppler radar winds, since the beam has to tilt up a little bit in order to avoid blocking by trees and getting things and other structures in the way, things we call ground clutter, most of the time they're measuring at somewhere the 30 to 50 feet range above ground as their lowest altitude. And the problem is then because the friction becomes so much more as you get down toward the ground, there's a very nonlinear relationship between winds at 50 feet and what they might be at the 10 feet level, but it probably varies from occasion to occasion. We don't know exactly the right algorithm for translating a 50-foot measured wind to what it would be at 10-foot level. because of that frictional effect and how it varies with stability and roughness of the particular area that the winds would be in. And then also, it seems as if, from what we can see, that some tornadoes, the fastest winds might be 100 feet, and other tornadoes, the fastest winds might be down at 10 feet. So that combination of tornado variability and an unknown transform from the radar measured altitude down to the 10-foot altitude is a problem.
We've been receiving questions for Dr. Greg Forbes at tornadotalk.com. And this question comes from Alan Kane. Alan wanted to know what his most unusual tornado outbreak was.
Wow. Well, that is an interesting question, a different kind of question. Certainly the worst outbreak that I've covered, there have been two super outbreaks, one that I covered in a damage survey mode, the 1974 super outbreak.
The National Weather Service says it has sighted a tornado near the greater Cincinnati airport. Here is the National Weather Service with the latest report.
It is a funnel cloud. It looks to be about 200 feet off. No, now it is touching the ground.
What is it doing now?
Heading directly toward Hamilton County.
This family of tornadoes that's just southwest of the city now, it's going to go up the west side of the city and through the northwest side of the city.
And one that I covered on air as a severe weather expert at the Weather Channel, the 2011 super outbreak.
We have tornado emergencies for some of the other areas. There's been a large tornado reported heading toward the Tuscaloosa area, a wedge tornado. It's near Mantua, should be within 10 to 15 miles now of the Tuscaloosa area. There have been outbreaks. I covered the tornado outbreak, the multi-day outbreak from Hurricane Ivan. That's certainly the tornado outbreaks associated with hurricanes, certainly very different beasts in many cases than those from more traditional spring severe weather outbreaks. And there's been some cases that have been cold core, where the tornadoes are low-topped or associated with low-top thunderstorms and cold air aloft, so that there's been a whole range of types of tornadoes, and then some that are under the cold air coming into the West Coast in some of the winter storms. So I've covered a whole lot of different situations, but coming up with one that's the most unusual, probably a little bit of a challenge right off the top of my head here.
When your career in meteorology spans decades, you've no doubt seen many severe weather events. There are some that stick in your mind as the biggest. Dr. Forbes says in addition to the 2011 Dixie Alley outbreak he covered on television, there have been several others.
Well, I think those two super outbreaks had probably the most impact or the most memorable events in my career, but there's been some others. The 1985 tornado outbreak in the Pennsylvania-Ohio area, I was at Penn State at the time, and we had a radar there. I was following, it wasn't Doppler, but there were big supercells and hook echoes that you just don't see hardly ever in Pennsylvania that I was following. There were some other outbreaks in the 90s, smaller ones in Pennsylvania that I followed, and I did some damage surveys of those tornadoes on those occasions as well. So that was very interesting, looking at tornadoes and their paths across rugged terrain of Pennsylvania. The mountains aren't big, but the transition from valley to mountaintop is pretty sharp in some of those. So that was very interesting. Of course, there's been a number of other notable tornadoes that we covered. The Mike Bettis was out in the field in 2009, and I was in the studio, and we were jointly narrating his observations, and it was the first of the tornadoes that was captured and documented by the Vortex 2 research project. That was in Wyoming in June 2009. And then the following year, I went out chasing tornadoes along with Mike Bettis, and we came across a fairly sizable tornado in Oklahoma on May 10th. And then subsequent years, let me think, 2013, I suppose, caught a tornado real close to us, and it was roped out, so it was kind of, the rope part was kind of right over top of us. And then another tornado formed. These were land spot type tornadoes. Another tornado formed real close to us, so that was real exciting. A couple of days later came the Moore, Oklahoma tornado. You know, we didn't see that tornado in progress, but we certainly saw the damage that it had done, and covered that from the field. So that was exciting. The El Reno tornado, that Mike Bettis got caught in. I was in the studio for that one, and that was a pretty scary time. And we suddenly realized that the tornado had probably gone right over his location, and we started to really, really worry. I went over to the video acquisition center that would be in communication with him, and I asked, have we heard from Mike? Are they all okay? And finally the word came in that they had been hit, but they all survived.
The El Reno, Oklahoma tornado has been one of the most studied tornadoes ever. Harrison Sincavage wanted to ask if the tornado that occurred on May 31st, 2013 needs new nomenclature. Reason being is that those vortices were the size of regular tornadoes, identical in size to what occurred in May of this year near Dodge City, Kansas. Achieving a vortex breakdown is a complicated process, but when it occurred within those multi-vortex tornadoes, the subvortices were very large.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I described it on air, and I think some of the researchers have basically said this in publications since then, that the so-called El Reno tornado was really the mesocyclone on the ground. The mesocyclone being the whole rotating wall cloud portion, or the whole rotating updraft portion of the supercell thunderstorm that got so intense that it was essentially not confined to cloud base and above, but it worked its way right down to the ground. And so I think some of these huge tornadoes are, I'll backtrack for a second. We like to make concise categorization of things. Well, you've got the tornado, you've got the section vortices, you've got the mesocyclone, etc. But there are always, in the real atmosphere, there are not always these very distinct distinctions. Instead, there are continual transitions from one to the other. And I think sometimes big, wide tornadoes are sometimes these mesocyclones that are down to the ground. I think the El Reno case was probably the extreme example that we've had of that thus far, so that in that sense, the mesocyclone too can break down, and there's been previous examples of that proposed or published or theorized, at least in the literature, that mesocyclones can have more than one tornado revolving about them. And so that could have been the case in the El Reno situation, that maybe those were tornadoes revolving about that parent mesocyclone rather than section vortices revolving around a great big tornado. So from what I saw of the Mike Bettis video, as they were racing away from just trying to get away from the tornado, those were, I definitely would have called those, they were small enough, I would have definitely called those suction vortices within a big tornado.
While Dr. Greg Forbes was not in the field observing the El Reno twister, he did encounter the damage from the 2013 Moore, Oklahoma tornado that hit the Briarwood Elementary School. We wanted to know what led to upgrading it from a high-end EF4 to an EF5.
There had been a big water tank that had landed in the midst of the residential area right there near the elementary school, and where we were broadcasting from. And I had gone and asked the residents, this doesn't look right. This big thing, surely this wasn't just right in the middle. And they said, no, it came in during the tornado. So it had been some big water tank from a farm about a half mile away that had landed, flown through the air and landed in this residential area that had been so heavily destroyed. as it turns out, there was a second one that landed on the school. We hadn't seen it. We couldn't see it from our vantage point, but it had landed on the school and I guess went down through the roof. To me, that's out of the ordinary. That's extraordinary, and probably this ought to be an EF5. And then they went on to find a couple of structure locations that also, technically by the EF descriptor standards, met the 5 criteria.
Severe weather outbreaks can lead to long days and nights on the air. Dr. Forbes told us what keeps him going behind the scenes when storms don't slow down.
What really keeps me going through the event is that I'm a big fan of Diet Coke with Splenda as the sweetener, and I sort of alternate that with caffeine-free Diet Dr. Pepper so that I don't get too much caffeine in my system. So I, my sodas and ice cream are sort of the things that I'm best known for.
And with that, we decided to learn more. What are some of the things we've always wanted to ask but never knew about Dr. Forbes? He's sometimes referred to as Storm Master G at the Weather Channel, but in school, kids gave him a different name.
Yeah, I had a bunch of nicknames. In first grade, sometimes the kids weren't didn't have great pronunciations or might have had trouble pronouncing things. So Gregory, or Greg, the one little girl called Geg, or Geggy, and then I had a crew cut at the time, was sort of one of the styles, and so my big oval-shaped head, they started calling me Eggy. So I was Eggy or Egghead or in my elementary school days.
Geg, Eggy, or Egghead knew better to stay out of trouble. But it was one incident he confessed to his mother that forever stays in his mind.
I guess the one thing that I remember, we lived out in the country, and I had a BB gun, and so, you always were trying to see how good you were with your aim and so on, and so the one day I figured I would probably miss because the BB guns weren't all that accurate. I was probably 100 yards away or whatever, but I took aim at a bird that was sitting on a branch and wound up hitting it and killing it, and I felt so bad about it. And my mother loved birds. She always was putting out, bird feed for the birds to come, and so I felt so bad. And I, of course, told her, and I sat around and long-faced for the rest of the day there, and I'm not sure if I know I never shot anything else again. Maybe I suppose I shot the BB gun at targets or something after that, but that was certainly one thing that I remember.
Dr. Forbes knew he loved science from the time he was young, but what would he be doing if he had not gone into meteorology?
Well, I knew I wanted to be a scientist, and I always had some interest in geology, so potentially it could have been a geologist as well. So that maybe would have been a second choice. I did take some classes in geology.
Severe weather doesn't have open and close hours. It's a 24-hour-a-day business, so free time is often found when storms stay away. Dr. Forbes says he has one hobby to keep him occupied.
I tend to be a picker and a collector, so my collecting hobby at the moment is looking for autographed books, especially if they're sort of somebody that you've heard of. So I've got quite a few autographed books at this point.
During the off-season, everyone needs a vacation. Dr. Forbes says it's a chance to see friends and family.
In the winter and to some extent, if in the fall, if there's not tropical storms, I have a little bit more free time, and so usually in July, I go and join my cousin and his family at North Myrtle Beach for some vacation. I plan to do that this year, and my cousin and a friend often come down in August around my birthday time, and we take some day trips around in Georgia, and then sometime in October or November they sort of tend to come down, and we take some day trips. So, and then I usually go back to Pennsylvania for Christmas or New Year's or somewhere around that time. some spending time with the family.
Traveling can be a great time for relaxation, but what if you could travel in a time machine?
Marty! You've got to come back with me! Where? Back to the future!
We told Dr. Forbes he had two choices. He could travel forward in time to learn about the technology of weather, or go back in time to teach people things yet to be discovered.
I certainly would like to see in the future what changes have been made, for example, in terms of, are we able to use computers to predict tornado and give tornado warnings, predicting them instead of just detecting them. That's sort of what the plan is for 10 years or so from now, is to warn on forecasts rather than warning on detection based on radar or sightings like we do now. So that would be exciting. And maybe, hopefully I'll live long enough to see that happen. Things are advancing so fast now that I'll probably live to see a lot of things. I know Dr. Fujita would have been so excited to be able to see the results of these mobile Doppler radars and all of these cloud resolving computers, storm resolving computers that we have now. He'd be so excited if he could have lived another decade or two to see all the advances that have taken place. For me, it would also be kind of fun to go back to the past. I spent some time in the Netherlands and in other countries, but I was about a year total in the Netherlands, Holland as we often call it, and was fascinated by castles. I got a little bit of free time to travel around to France and Germany, and so I would always try to go and see these castles. So one branch of my family tree that I've done a little bit of genealogy suggests that if that link is correct, that would actually have me related to some of the nobility, the kings and queens and the families of the Europe area. And so I think maybe that's part of my fascination with castles. So I guess I'd like to go back to the Middle Ages and see if I was really involved in some of that. If I went back, it would probably be to look at that kind of thing.
Time has been good to Dr. Greg Forbes. He's been at the Weather Channel since 1999. In May of 2014, it was announced he had colon cancer. The prognosis was good, and after treatments, Dr. Forbes posted on his Facebook page that they found no traces of cancer in his body, and he is in remission. We've learned a lot from a man so full of passion about weather and science. And even during the stormiest weather, many beautiful days are ahead.
Next on Tornado Talk, outbreak in Ohio. The towns of Sandusky and Lorain were devastated on June 28, 1924, a time when there were no cell phones and no sirens. What warning was there? Outbreak in Ohio on Tornado Talk.
This has been Tornado Talk, powered by thestormreport.com.